I think what the Canadian and the Indian government should do is they should not speak through the media, but they should speak through official spokespersons about what they're doing to resolve this issue. So if the Indian government, if the Canadian government has given the Indian government evidence, then the Indian government should say, what they've done with that evidence and what their response to that evidence is. All this information should be laid out in public, because when things happen behind closed doors, I think that's when people become suspicious and they lose their trust in their elected leaders. So I think the first thing is that the Canadian and the Indian government, they need to start having some more dialogue, and they need to start addressing the issues that have been raised. And they need to understand, what is the truth, not their individual truths, but what's the actual truth. Was Mr. Nijjar killed by Indian, agents? Were they people who just happened to be Indian? Was this a dispute over a drug deal? Was it a dispute over Gurdwara politics? We need to find out what exactly happened and make sure that the RCMP can get to the bottom of this. And I think the number one thing that the Canadian and the Indian government need to do, is to make sure that they don't contaminate and corrupt the RCMP's investigative process. A lot of people are already concerned that the Prime Minister, by speaking out in Parliament last week, he's tainted the whole investigative process, the whole legal process, because what will the RCMP do if they find out that the Canadian government, the Prime Minister's allegations or innuendo was totally off base? Will the RCMP feel pressured to tailor their recommendations or their findings to support their Prime Minister, or are they willing to create a global incident if it turns out that Mr. Nijjar's murder had nothing to do with the Indian government, and it could have been over some other issue? Either way, the Canadian people want to know. We want to know that we're safe in Canada from foreign governments, from foreigners, and even from terrorist acts within our own country. So let's make sure that this is not the 1980s again, and we don't bring foreign rhetoric into Canada. So I just wanted to share my feelings about the recent announcement that the Prime Minister of Canada made in Canadian Parliament about a week ago. When I heard that, I was very concerned because the announcement was full of prevarications. It was a lot of alleged, possible links, active investigation, and there were no actual solid leads or actual real information that the Canadian public could cling to and understand what's going on. And as a result of that, there's been a lot of unease and unrest in Canada, especially in the Indo-Canadian community, because the last time we had rhetoric like this, where people are saying Hindus go back, temples being defaced, there was a lot more terrorist activity that resulted in the worst Canadian terrorist attack in its history, where over 300 people were murdered and over 280 Canadians or so were killed in an explosion on a flight that left Canada. And nobody really paid for those murders. Nobody was prosecuted, or nobody was convicted of murder. And what was found in those days, was that the Canadian security agencies and the other agencies, CSIS and the RCMP, they failed to share their information. They deleted tapes, and they failed to protect witnesses. And I'm very concerned that something like that might happen again. There's a lot of concern that there might be another violent attack, and can we really trust the Canadian security agencies and the RCMP to protect the Canadian people, given that in 1985 they actively denied and covered up the terrorist links and what happened, and they denied it for 20-30 years until there was a Canadian inquiry into what happened. And we can't afford to have something like this today. I'm very disappointed that the Prime Minister made the, not even allegations, but basically just spoke a lot of innuendo and gossip, which I thought was not the right move for the leader of our country. Instead of bringing people together, it just seems that he's pushed people away. And one of the things about Canada is that it's open to everybody, for people from all over the world. And if we start inflaming people or raising rhetoric regarding issues that happen in another country, then we start losing what it means to be Canadian. If India is responsible, then India should be held accountable. But that's if. There should be proof, not conjecture or supposition or leaked sources, because we've already been through that in the 1980s. And you can't trust leaked sources. You just can't. You can't just trust and say that CSIS said this or CSIS found this, because there was a whole inquiry about how CSIS covered up the Air India bombing, which was the worst terrorist attack in Canadian history. And before September 11th, it was the worst aviation terrorist attack in the world. So nobody at CSIS was ever held accountable for their actions. Nobody at the RCMP was ever held accountable for failing to protect witnesses. So how can we trust the very organizations that are meant to protect us? And I'm just afraid that this is the 1980s all over again, and not in a good way.